of the Basic Income Conversations seminar series. So this is where we invite experts from academia and research spaces to discuss the latest research and more technical aspects of basic income. Today we're talking about probably our favorite type of research that shows just how feasible and how popular a basic income is. And with the new Prime Minister this week, winning the vote is for good ideas like basic income is more crucial than ever. We are joined by a fantastic panel this evening. We have Stuart Lansley, who is an economist and financial journalist. He's also author of The Richer, the Poorer, How Britain Enriched the Few and Failed the Poor, and also one of the co-authors of our most recently published paper, Tackling Poverty, the Power of a Universal Basic Income. So Stuart's going to give us an insight into the basic income model covered in this report this evening, but the headline is, even a modest basic income can cut poverty to the lowest level in 60 years. We've also been joined by Matthew Johnson, who is Professor of Politics at Northumbria University. Matthew also leads a research team focusing on the health case for a universal basic income. Matthew's going to be giving us a sneak peek of our upcoming report, Winning the Vote with a Universal Basic Income, Evidence from the Red Wall. That is the third of 4 papers from a Wellcome Trust funded project assessing the prospective impacts of universal basic income on anxiety and depression amongst 14 to 24-year-olds. The first paper is the Tackling Poverty paper that Stuart will be talking about. The second is this interim report for the full project with foreword by First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford. There's the Winning the Vote paper that we'll be discussing this evening, and the final project paper is forthcoming towards the end of this year. So I'm really excited to be sharing some of this research with you this evening and for the full paper to be published very soon. Really excited to hear from Matthew this evening. It just super clearly lays out the level of support for basic income and how this proves that political parties should be committing to bold, fit-for-purpose policies, specifically a basic income. And it also talks us through some of the most compelling narratives for basic income that have been given to us by science. So scientifically proven sound bites on basic income as a godsend to any of us trying to spread the word. A final panelist this evening is Will Strong, Economic and Social Research Council Research Fellow and Director of Research for Autonomy. We've worked with Will and Autonomy on projects looking at a basic income for Wales. Some of that was funded by the Future Generations Commissioner of Wales and has been fed into the Welsh Basic Income Pilot for care leavers, which is obviously the biggest, most exciting project that's ever happened in the UK on basic income, people receiving a basic income at this point in time, that started this summer and will continue for another couple of years. So this evening, Will's going to help us mull over how we can put research into action. Autonomy, fantastic at doing that. And he'll be able to draw parallels between the work on basic income and the super exciting 4-day-week pilot projects that Autonomy is supporting across the UK at the moment. So these seminars are just one of the activities we run to help people have productive basic income conversations that each get us a bit closer to a basic income for all. During the second half of this session, there'll be plenty of time for questions for our speakers. But if you come away from this event with your mind buzzing and wanting a space where you get to be the experts, you get to do the talking, do come along to our next event, which is in just over 2 weeks' time, Big Basic Income Conversation, which is on Wednesday, 21st of September. Lots of people there to talk to about basic income, and you're the experts in that session. And we really do encourage you to take that expert role. We've got our excellent panel this evening, but you're certainly experts too. The most compelling evidence for a basic income are the things that just aren't working at the moment, that are sort of having an effect on us in our day-to-day lives. Unfortunately, that list is quite big at the moment, but change in a basic income coming, and that will be accelerated by conversations between people like us. So join for the Big Basic Income Conversation on the 21st, or you can host your own basic income conversation anytime using our toolkit. And I'll stick some links in the chat about the things that I've mentioned in that introduction just there, so you can have them to peruse. Before I hand over to our panel, do put your questions in the Q&A throughout, and thank you for saying hello in the chat. It's lovely to see so many names and from so many locations. Do continue doing that as we go along. We do tend to get lots of the questions bunched up at the end of the discussion, so make sure to ask them as soon as possible. Don't feel shy to pipe up with a question, and wonderful Samuel will be picking people and picking questions. If you see a question already asked that you like the look of, do upvote it. and we'll sort of prioritise the questions that look like most people want to hear the answer to most quickly. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Stuart for our first contribution.
Sorry, I was just unmuting. So, well, hello everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. There are lots of arguments in favour of a basic income. The idea of having a guaranteed income floor, which would give people a lot more security. The idea that, that a basic income would be non-judgmental, would get away from the kind of coercive way the benefit system is operated. It would be a source of a sort of a freedom that people will have better life choices over things like education, training, what sort of work, whether to take up a hobby or volunteer and so on. And it would also, we know that the idea of giving everybody a secure, guaranteed income there's lots of evidence that improves the social outcomes in society, particularly in the case of health. That we know that there would be, if we had some kind of basic income, that there would eventually be a dynamic benefit to people's health. But I really want to look at one aspect of a basic income, and that is the impact upon poverty and inequality. We have a serious crisis of inequality and poverty in Britain that's been brewing for 4 decades, and it is getting worse. And this, if we look at the 1970s, was a period of historic achievement, because it was a period of peak equality. We have never been more equal as a society than we were in the late 1970s. And that's true of poverty as well. The 1970s was a low point for poverty. Unfortunately, these achievements were very short-lived, and those gains have been reversed over the last 40 years. So Britain has effectively moved from being one of the most equal countries in the world to the second most unequal. The level of poverty in Britain has pretty well doubled, and more than doubled in the case of children. And one of the consequences of this high rate of poverty and high level of inequality is that Britain's poorest fifth of the population are quite a lot poorer than their equivalents in other comparable countries. So, for example, the poorest fifth in Germany are actually a third better off than they are in Britain. Let's have a look at the effect that a basic income might have on poverty and inequality. Would it improve this situation? And if so, how? Well, our latest study has looked at different levels of basic income and their impact. If we start with even a very basic income level, which, let's say, paying children £41 a week and adults £63 a week, those are quite modest sums, but they would mean £11,000 guaranteed, no questions asked, non-means tested sum annually for a family of 4. That's not enough to live on, but given all the other forms of income, we're not replacing the existing social security system. What we're suggesting is that this is grafted onto the existing system and would kind of sit below it. It would provide a floor below nobody would fall. Now, the results of our latest simulation, it shows that even this very basic model would have quite a dramatic effect upon people's incomes at the bottom. It would actually cut poverty by about 60%, and that would take poverty down below the lowest level achieved in the 1970s. And so it would be that we would have the lowest level of poverty in history. And that's true of children. It's also true of pensioners. So the level of child poverty would fall by about 60%. The level of poverty amongst pensioners would fall by just over 50%. There would also be a fairly significant reduction in inequality, not back to the low levels of the 1970s, but about 2/3 of the way back. So a considerable achievement there as well. Now, of course, paying everybody a sum such as that would be, the gross cost would be high. So we'd have to find a way of meeting the cost. And the way we have chosen effectively to meet the cost is through tax changes. There are other ways of doing it. And even modest tax changes would be enough to meet the gross cost. And the effect of what we would do is abolish the personal income tax allowance, which costs £110 billion and basically is a regressive form of allowance, in the sense it benefits the better off more than those on the lowest incomes. This would of itself have a very progressive effect. And the other tax changes we would require would be to add 3p on each of the current tax rates, the standard rate and the two higher rates. Now, one of the reasons why we've had such a high level of poverty, this great increase in poverty over the last 40 years, is that successive governments have basically weakened the redistributive power of the tax benefit system. So taxes have become more aggressive. They've become a higher burden on lower income groups than higher income groups. And on top of that, we've had successive rounds of cuts in benefits, particularly for those of working age. The effect of this model would actually be to reconstruct the whole tax benefit system, so it returns to more closely to the progressive redistributive tax benefit model of the pre-1980s. So the effect, in essentially, is what we're actually doing, is recreating, and if we were to implement this scheme, we would be recreating a 1945 moment, the moment when there were a rolling set of progressive changes that effectively introduced new pro-equality, anti-poverty instruments into the economic and social system. And this model, although it wouldn't completely eliminate poverty, and we would still need other policies alongside it, it would have a similar effect to 1945 in the sense of reconstituting these pro-equality and pro-poor policies against the kind of, which would undermine and try and challenge the pro-inequality bias of the present system. So critics of basic income have tended to say that a basic income is unaffordable and wouldn't really make much of a difference given the cost. Well, I think what these studies have shown is that a basic income, even a modest basic income, would be both affordable, feasible, and highly progressive. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. That's fabulous. I'm going to hand over to Matthew now.
Thanks very much, Cleo. Okay, so I've been working with Stuart for the last couple of years, and Stuart's brilliant because he's able to conceptualize the impact of really quite complicated tax changes in such an easily digestible form. So I'm going to move on from Stuart's economic coverage somewhat to a much vaguer and more amorphous discussion, which is public opinion. So the starting point for the work that we've done on public opinion has been a certain degree of incredulity. So after the 2019 election, where Labour had stood on a progressive socioeconomic platform, a lot of people on the right of Labour and in the centrists in general concluded that this was a general public that was wholeheartedly opposed to progressive reform. And the last few years, it's been quite interesting hearing people talking about red wall constituencies as if they are some sort of libertarian right-wing paradises in which it's impossible to hold anything vaguely associated with a progressive view on reform. And that's just bizarre, because the people that I live amongst and the people that I'm related to are firmly committed to redistributive policies because they benefit from them. And what we set out to do in the work that was conducted with Daniel Nettle, Howard Reed, Elliot Johnson, with whom I share too many genes, is to test the destruction, the claim made by centrist figures and by those on the right of the Labour Party that it is impossible to win in the red wall with progressive socioeconomic policy. So what we did was to start with the premise that you've got very different needs in the red wall. The red wall is a set of constituencies that's been held by had been held by Labour for decades. That was in lots of different ways. Aging was declining in its material conditions. And it was quite clear that there was a big gap between young and old, that older people had quite clear health needs, which had become salient during the pandemic, and younger people had quite clear economic needs around the need for economic security that had become extremely clear during the pandemic. So we just tested two narratives on, I think it was a sample of something like 800 people within a few red wall constituencies. And we said, look, here are two narratives. One suggests that universal basic income can substantively improve people's health, which it can through a range of different ways that we can demonstrate. And we went to the same panel and said, look, here's ways in which universal basic income can increase people's economic security. They were quite effectively framed, but the narratives alone received general levels of support between 70 and 80%. Now, that's even higher than the nationally representative samples that we'd previously taken during the pandemic. But generally, you get between 75, 85, 80% approval ratings for universal basic income if you present people with basic framings around economic security and health. And what you find is that there is a statistical significant difference between levels of support. So older people do support universal basic income in significantly higher levels when you say that it's there to promote people's health. Younger people do support universal basic income in increased levels when you present it in terms of economic security. And what we thought was, oh, that's all very interesting. But what about people who really hate universal basic income, the people who are presented as the right-wing Taliban of the Red Wall? So what we did was we worked with 20 people who expressed total disgust at the idea of universal basic income. And we tried to distill their ideas to work with them to create 6 narratives that these opponents of universal basic income would present to their friends, people like them who were similarly opposed to UBI, to persuade them of UBI's benefit. And the narratives that they produced were really interesting. They focused on things like the risk of destitution to British citizens. They focused on the way in which universal basic income can support forms of independent living, forms of flourishing, these sorts of things. But what was really interesting overall is that the narratives that were produced by people who hate universal basic income were even more impactful than those that were produced by people who support UBI. So that may or may not surprise you. But the incredible thing that we found was when you present these narratives on UBI to Red Wall voters, people who hate UBI increase their level of approval of UBI from around about 13% up to 50%. So that's statistically really quite significant. People who like UBI originally increase their support further. Now, what this demonstrates really quite conclusively is that people's policy preferences in this particular part of Britain, but beyond it and in general, are forged not by abstract commitment to values, not by commitment to unchanging ideas about how we ought to organise the world, but actually about how best people can promote their material interest within their given circumstances. people are really fluid. And what we've got at the minute is a political class that regards people's views as being totally fixed, totally incapable of being changed, and doesn't try to change people's preferences. So the big takeaway from this is, if you present a policy like UBI effectively to voters, they recognize its value, support it in incredibly high levels, and actually come to regard it as being pivotal to the success of a particular political program. So that's really important, and that's a really significant finding. Who would guess that people in need of a policy like UBI could be persuaded of its benefits? That's incredible. And when you think about it, what we're told about people's preferences in this country is totally counterintuitive. People say it's impossible to get people to pursue policies that are in their interests, when actually the underpinning assumption of that is it's very easy to get people to pursue policies that are totally against their interests. The opposite's true. We just don't bother trying to persuade people. Another finding that might interest people beyond that is that we submitted costings for each of these different schemes. And conventional sense would say the cheapest scheme is the most effective. It'll be the most popular. And what we found is that's just not true. It's the least popular policy. And it's the least popular policy in the case of UBI as against other welfare schemes, because whereas with other welfare schemes where welfare is regarded as an outgroup policy, and therefore people just go, well, I want to spend as little as possible, giving other people who I may or may not regard as being free riders money. With UBI, people say, well, look, that's actually my social security, and I need X number of pounds in order to survive. So young people in particular want high levels of UBI, and statistically, in statistical terms, the levels of support for generous schemes that go beyond the UK pension scheme for pensioners that would roll that out across all age groups are much more popular. So you get levels of support 62% weighted, which is really quite impressive. That's an incredibly popular policy. So fully costed, people know that there's going to be hundreds of billions of pounds used up in quantitative easing. People still go, that's a really popular policy. And when you look at the kind of policy that Liz Truss has adopted today, which pretty much involves literally burning in gas £100 billion with no appreciable benefit in the long term, you can see that people's concerns about public debt have completely changed. There is no longer this concern about the personal impact of public debt in the way there was 12 years ago. So that's long-winded and all the rest of it, but hopefully it's of interest. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you, Matthew. And we've got some narratives in the chat as well, which I think we might come back to, see how they compare to the ones that are in the report in due course. Do keep putting your questions in the Q&A as the questions come up, and we'll hear from Will now.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Stuart and Matthew, for those opening comments. I think, yeah, you deserve congrats for the reports. I think it's such important work that the Basic Income Conversation do. I've worked with Clio since 2020, so about 2 years now, and it's just really grown and grown. It's really great to see, because I think, I mean, the organisation that I'm from, which is Autonomy, we started 5 years ago, and back in 2017, you know, very few organisations were doing the work that Basic Income Conversation are doing now. There's a few mentions of basic income here. There's a few policy papers out there, but I think it's really put a booster under it. So I think that's really fantastic, and I look forward to working further with the organisation. So I'm the Director of Research at Autonomy. We do a lot of kind of work on the future of work, really. So that's policy, that's kind of social and political listening, that's general quant and qualitative research. And we've been kind of pursuing basic income as a kind of policy area since we started. And I think the piece we did with Clio around the Welsh basic income scheme, and, you know, with the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, we worked with Stuart as well on that. That's really nice to see that's going to come to fruition in this basic income pilot in Wales. So we're very excited to see that as it will kind of follow it as it goes on, really. we should say, if you're any of you in Liverpool in September, we also have a panel with Beth Winter and Andy Burnham and Cleo herself also talking about basic income. So please do come along to that. I mean, I'm basically just going to say a few words about why I think, I spend a lot of my time arguing with people about basic income, basically. And I think in the policy sector, there's still some ambiguity around this, targeted versus universal, kind of, is it too expensive and so on. And I think, is it too ambitious? There's been a bit of a retrenchment of some of the ambition of policy in recent years. I think that's a real shame. I think what Matthew was saying around being a vote winner is really, really important for that reason, that actually we shouldn't just back away from obviously economically sound and kind of equality boosting policies just because we have some kind of idea about what the working class think and so on. In fact, the persuasion and framing and things like that are really important, and often when you unpack some of these fears, it comes down to ideology, and I think actually we should kind of shatter through that presupposition. Now, I guess for me, what cuts through most of my discussions, there's all sorts of benefits of basic income, and Stuart did lay out some of the good reasons why we should support it. I think we all know some of the general spread, but I think of course what I've been focusing on recently is about economic security, and I think we should just think about that for a second and then kind of question whether our welfare system and the welfare systems of the past have really been about that. My PhD was on the history of unemployment in the UK. And I think if you look at that past, there's a bit of a checkered history here as to what function the welfare state has played and what came before it has played. So looking at things like, before the job centre, we had labour exchanges. You look at those debates in Parliament between Churchill and others around what should the function of these things be. And often they're talking about how to kind of decide who are the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, who's the kind of idle man and who's the man who's ready to work, and trying to distinguish those in a kind of punitive way. Before that, we had the workhouse, and I think that blip in 1945 that Stuart identified really was a blip, and ultimately that world has passed now. So I think on the one hand, it is right that this fantastic new report does show the huge relative gains, which are, you can compare the 1945 moment, that's really important. But at the same time, that world in 1945 has gone, and so many people now fall through the cracks of the labour market, fall through the cracks of our social security system, because it's premised on a world of work that simply does not exist. Not that everyone is in the gig economy anymore, but there's so many different circumstances now, and the system's been tied up so much, there's so many hoops to jump through, that I think the best case for my side is, what I've learned through arguing and thinking through the best, one of the best cases for basic income is really about that coverage, and really about that, kind of thinking about maybe for the first time, we could have a social security system that's not about testing behavior and testing circumstances in a way to say, no, you're not eligible, but actually it's one which enables, really. And so I think, again, coming back to Matthew's point about the current moment, I think, in the political spectrum, across the political spectrum, this is what, I talk to those on the left as well, like what does the progressive welfare system look like? And actually that's a real weakness in the arguments on even on the left. The centre and right, there's very different opinions, but even on those who like to think that they do care about poverty and inequality, they have a very bad answer to what they think the welfare state should look like. Do you think it should have behaviour testing conditionality? Probably not. Do you think the levels of payment should be higher and should have greater reach? Probably. Well, you're getting towards a basic income to some extent. If you go through that way, you start unlocking those arguments a bit more, then suddenly you kind of get to the idea that you need to have a universal, unconditional cash payment, which actually is probably the best way with progressive taxation. So I think that's something which people can get behind. So that's why I think basic income that's my best route in as a case. Why now? And I'll be very brief. I think, but as Stuart touched on this, we live in a time of crisis. I think it should have been around for decades, but we live in a time of crisis. We've had 2008, we've had Brexit, the effects of which are still to unfold, COVID, and now the energy crisis. And then looming behind the energy crisis is the climate crisis. Some people are talking about this energy crisis being the first climate-related crisis in terms of shortages, droughts, all this kind of stuff, as well as the war, obviously, in Ukraine. So in a time of crisis, what we need is security, we need some certainty, we need those floors. I like how Stuart always calls it a floor rather than a safety net. I think that we need that floor to be there. And ultimately, when we talk about who's going to pay for this, we should also talk about who's going to be protected from these crises. And we need to make sure that everyone gets protected and people don't fall through these cracks. So that, for me, we're working on this on a piece around price caps right now, autonomy, and we're also thinking about cash payments as necessary to make sure that we don't just have a continual slide of living standards to a time before March 2020. If you look at the inflation, we need to make sure that living standards can be brought back to a good level. So I don't think price caps are enough. And I think as we move to the climate crisis, when we need industrial change, we definitely need to have some kind of safety mechanisms in place. When we're changing industries and workers are in between work, the social security system is just not good enough. Like the wait times, all this stuff. So I think there's loads of good reasons why this is a future-proofing policy. And I think that's why I'm really looking forward to autonomy doing much more work on this. I think we should, all this kind of work that's coming out, I think is fantastic. I'll stop there. I also do work on 4-day weeks, but I think pilots are pilots. We can maybe talk about that some in the questions potentially, but I didn't want to take up too much time, and we can maybe have a good discussion in the chat.
Thank you very much. Well, yeah, really lots and lots to get our heads around this evening, and in the chat as well. There's loads. My brain's buzzing for the first time today. Actually, it's been a bit slow. Great. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. Do keep getting your questions in the Q&A box. I'm sorry for the confusion there. We had the settings wrong initially, so that upvoting thing is only going to work for the last few questions submitted, but there's lots of good ones, and we'll pick and get through as many as possible. Stuart, I just wanted to, this has been asked in the chat as well. I wanted to ask about, what do we mean by the poorest fifth? I know it's kind of complicated, but how do you get there? And is there a simple way to just sort of say this is what we mean?
The way that we do these assessments of impact is to bunch people into income groups, but because there's lots of households of different size, that we have to adjust for household size, and we do this using equivalent units basically, and this brings everybody onto a common basis. And that means that the decile ranges don't really mean much in terms of people's actual income. So I can't give you the lowest fifth in terms of the equivalent income measure, but for a couple, and obviously it varies from size of family, but for a couple, I would think it's probably around 50, probably less, around 12,000 a year, I would say, for a couple. But whoever asked the question, if they like to send you an email and pass it on to me, I can sort of dig the answer out.
Thanks, Stuart. Well, and I'd like to see the answer too, because I think it'd be useful for us. We can put that on the website somewhere, and sort of link it so people always have that answer accessible. Also, just interested to hear from all of you, actually, like what were the sort of factors that led to the 70s being the most equal period? Obviously, we've talked about 1945, but is there a delay in that? Is that the same delay that we're looking at here makes it even more pressing that we're getting this stuff in the short term? Go for it, Will.
Okay, I mean, there's a few things, right? It's partly, yes, we partly had for example, in comparison to now, we had a more lax dole system, as it were. We had a much higher trade union representation, which were fighting for equality in the workplace, allowing for higher wages. There were still lots of people fighting for progressive policies. The economic imaginary was much more open then. It was kind of like the last heave before the let's say the neoliberal counter-revolution. Sorry about the siren outside my office. It's just the last little heave before the neoliberal counter-revolution. And of course, I guess speaking more nebulously in cultural terms, you obviously had, a time where, yes, high wages and like I say, a less punitive welfare system, although I'd still say it was punitive and exclusionary. That did lead to, a whole load of basically like different kinds of cultural experimentation and expression, which in America and the UK did allow for effectively a kind of, let's say, that played a part as it's understood in basically allowing for, let's say, a bit of a bulwark against like the most basically draconian and Victorian impulses of the British political system. But that's my brief answer. I'm sure that there's many other contributing factors.
Did you want to add anything in there, Stuart?
Can I just say that, I think the distinguishing feature of the post-war decades was that it was the high point of the philosophy of egalitarianism, if you like. in the sense what we had was a political party, the Labour Party, that had been promoting the idea of a more equal society for 50 or 60 years. And then you had a number of other factors, notably the war and the memories of the 1930s. And you had a public that, you know, was demanding change. So you had the, you know, three factors coming together that made this sort of transformative change possible. But without a, you know, political leadership that was determined to create greater equality, it wouldn't have happened. But what actually happened from 1945 is that a number of pro-equality instruments were built into the economy. And these operated in a kind of natural way to lift incomes at the bottom and to control them at the top. And these kind of instruments, I mean, Will's mentioned some of them, but we're talking about full employment, or full male employment anyway. We had buoyant wages, so the share of output going to wages rose compared with earlier periods, because there was a kind of unwritten contract with business that workers should be given a fairer deal. And then on top of that, you had an imperfect but a greatly improved sort of basic income floor. And these factors combined, I think, you know, that certainly for 20 years did help to drive this process towards greater equality and lower levels of poverty. Then, of course, the whole philosophy, this sort of pro-equality philosophy, started breaking down in the 1970s, in part because of the 1970s was the first global economic crisis, which raised unemployment, and people started to lose faith in social democracy, which seemed unable to cope with this economic crisis. And this gave rise to these new right pro-inequality evangelists, who basically argued that equality had gone far too far, and what Britain needed was a stiff dose of inequality. I mean, that's a sort of potted history of that period.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, a lot going on there. Matthew, people have been asking if we get to see the narratives that you've alluded to there in your introduction. Of course, we will be publishing the paper soon, so there's quite a lot there, and, you know, the sort of nuances, obviously the key there. So we will be sending that out by email, and then it will be available on our website if you're watching this in the future on YouTube. But do you want to give us a really quick rundown? Have you got them all in your head, or maybe hopefully in front of you on a bit of paper?
Yeah, I can. I think there are a lot less. I think they're a lot less interesting than just summarising the basic impulse, and it touches on what both Will and Stuart have just spoken to there. In the post-war British society, Labour and social democracy stood for a particular socio-economic programme that was radically distinct from what had gone before it, and presented a completely different pathway to the advancement of people's material interests. So you got people like my grandparents. So it doesn't matter how bad Labour are, they're always better. Under any context, Labour will always be better because they represent a distinct materialist vision of the world. And what you have, obviously, in the 90s and 2000s is the dissolution of that. It becomes very, very difficult for people to see whether there is a distinction in political vision. And actually, there's not really a distinction there, a substantive one. And what these narratives do is actually speak to a genuine distinction between visions of how best to promote people's interests. And they speak to older traditions of securing people's interests, fundamentally holding people in society, and ensuring they've got the foundation by which to advance whatever other interests they have in their lives. So the narratives we introduce speak to all of those things that my grandparents' generation held dear in the wake of the Second World War. It's about security. It's about having a particular way of ensuring that people are secured materially, particular way of ensuring that there is a national consensus on how we distribute resources, and a sense not just of an abstract account of fairness or something like that, but a real tangible vision about how best people can improve their lives. All of those narratives speak to that. And it's that narrative quality that's been lost by social democracy over the past 4 decades. And it's really interesting, actually, of course, talking about the people who really did change society in the 70s and 80s. It was young people, young, pampered boomers like my dad, who basically didn't work in the 70s, just sat around, sort of did what he liked, played the guitar. Up and down the country, it was really quite difficult to fail. And one of the interesting things that you find with the global economic crisis in the 70s is that you've got an incredibly secure generation, the baby boomers, who have none of the risk aversion of their parents because they've not been exposed to genuine social destitution, supporting an economic system that has high rewards for risk takers, but incredible long-term damage for large parts of the population by its removal of social security. Sort of narratives we talked about really are about reintroducing social security.
Thanks, Matthew. Great. So I think the questions, I want to get through as many as possible because they're coming in thick and fast and they're all fantastic. So Jessica, are you okay to unmute and ask the questions that you popped in the Q&A just now?
Okay, I asked a few questions, and these are the kinds of questions that people ask me, which I don't know how to answer. So how does universal basic income not fuel price inflation or undercut wages? And the other question is about, is it truly universal what's being proposed here? Or is it only, a sort of a version of welfare to apply to the poorest? Because I sort of feel like, part of what we're talking about here is reducing inequality and increasing self-determination, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, which that income gives people the opportunity to increase. So, when it's only applied to the poor, it's really just a safety net and not actually a driver of, people being able to fulfill their needs and their self-actualization, to use Maslow's.
Thank you. Hierarchy, yeah.
Hierarchy of need, yes.
Yeah. That goes back. We want everyone to be sitting around playing the guitar like Matthew's dad.
Playing the guitar and taking care of each other and, coming up with new ideas and creating things and building things and all of the things that they're not able to do because they're basically just trying to survive.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jessica, for the question. So we've got how would basic income affect inflation and wages? How do we make sure that that's not a negative impact? And the question about, is it just a targeted policy or more of a safety net than a universal policy? Stuart, I feel like I'll come to you first because it's your model.
Okay, well, can I take the second one first, which is the thing about the present, the thing about the post-war system of national insurance was it had two basic principles. The first was it was universal. Everybody paid into it, and everybody was able to be paid out when they needed it. Secondly, it was based on entitlement, i.e., people had a right, a social right, to an income when they were unemployed or when they were older or when they had an illness and so on. So these were completely new principles. What's happened over the last 30 or 40 years of those two key principles of universalism and entitlement have been pretty well completely eroded. So the present benefit system is heavily means tested. Only a minimal bit of it is universal. And secondly, the question of entitlement has been completely eroded. So if we take the question of, the unemployed, the benefit system operates in such a way that it's highly punitive, it's highly coercive, i.e. that there are very, very tough rules that mean your benefit is withdrawn through sanctions if you don't comply with the rules imposed by the Department of Work and Pensions. Indeed, these rules have been tightened heavily over the last decade and a half. And in the mid-2010s, between sort of 2013 and 2018, 5 million sanctions were administered. I mean, and these are effectively fines. It means most of the people suffering those sanctions ended up with no income. And if they were lived on their own, they would have no income. Or if they lived with the family, there should be a significant cut in their incomes. This is essentially what's happened. During that period, the Department of Work and Pension was imposing more fines than the criminal justice system. So the effect of a basic income would be to return and reinforce and reinstate those two principles. Firstly, universal, because everybody would get these payments, rich and poor, whatever your circumstances, you would get them. They were guaranteed, no questions asked, no coercion, no sanctions, and so on. So it is genuinely universal. And then to ensure that the gains are the gains are enjoyed most heavily by the lowest income groups. This is why, developing a more progressive tax system would effectively take the money away from the top third in order to benefit the bottom. So the redistribution of the scheme is built into the tax system. So it is completely universal, but it's also, the entitlement is there. There's no stigma about it. There's ministers can't go around saying, as they continuously do, and the Daily Mail and the Daily Express say, constantly, that people are scroungers on the benefit system. This is a right. This is a social right. You have entitlement to it, and you are completely. It's non-judgmental, and you are completely free to choose how to use that guarantee, whether you choose to take periods out of work or whether you choose to work more. I mean, I can answer the other question. Probably if someone else wants to answer the question about wages and
let's go to Will.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, I think, look, it's important to point out that wages right now are stagnant. So the slowest wage growth since the Napoleonic era, right? I mean, there's a little blip in COVID, but that was, ultimately, that's effectively an anomaly. And I think it's important to recognise that, we've seen this in some sectors, this phenomenon of the Great Resignation, and it's created great demand for workers and so on. Just imagine if there was a real walkout of bad jobs, and having something like a basic income where you don't have the threat of unemployment and you don't have the threat of universal credit, which are classic and very traditional sticks to beat people with. The threat of what am I going to do if I don't have a job? I've got literally nothing to fall back on, apart from those with savings. That's something which I think would empower people to argue for, and particularly in this climate, higher wages. This is something which we're seeing in some sectors. Some great wins by Unite and other trade unions for 15% pay rises for truck drivers here, and rubbish collectors and so on. So I think we shouldn't think that the only way to achieve higher wages is to remain with a punitive welfare system. I think it's kind of the other way around, in a way, that actually, if you give people the confidence to basically go, as Stuart says, go unemployed for a bit, because they know they can have other options. Employers will know that too, and they know they can't just say, well, you won't leave because you don't want to be unemployed. So I don't think it will lead to undercutting wages. Inflation wise, I mean, as Stuart said, this is a redistributive measure. We're not creating money out of thin air. We're taking money from high earners, and potentially in some cases might be a wealth tax and so on, and giving that to people who spend rather than save. So I don't think necessarily as far as I understand it, there will be much of an inflation problem. I think inflation, as we know, is driven by not high wages and not that high incomes. It's really it's driven. There's no wage price spiral, and therefore I don't think we have the same thing. Universalism, I think, is a really good question. We do need to make sure it's universal, and that's why, as far as I understand it, all of basic income conversations reports, as well as our own, have been about residence and residency rather than necessarily any other kind of metrics. I think if you are a resident in this country, obviously at some point we'd like to have, you know, international basic income guarantees and so on, but I think, you know, we also got to have a certain amount of pragmatism. I think that makes sense to have a residency in the UK, and obviously we can think about other kind of tiers for non-residents. I think that's something we just have to argue. And I think what was the other thing I was going to say? Yes, and for the amounts we're talking about, I think it's important to think about a gradual increase here. So if you have a basic income policy and a basic income deployment, I think you know, so what speaks to something Matthew was saying as well. You give people a stake, and therefore you create something that people have a stake in. It's very, very hard and very, very unpopular to basically say, oh, we're getting rid of that, or we're basically reducing those basic income payments, basically. I think that's something which is, you know, right now, a lot of people don't have a stake in the welfare system. So I think in terms of like what that does, I think that's a game changer. I think that's what I wanted to speak to.
Thank you, Will. And thanks, Karen, for your patience there. Keen to hear from you and your question.
Okay, thanks. Well, it's sort of in two parts. I mean, I live in Wales, which is more progressive than has more progressive government than the UK government. But I'm interested in what work is going on to persuade MPs, you know, in UK government of the benefits and the vote-winning aspects of UBI. That's the first part. So, you know, is there work happening? And then what are the stances of the main political parties currently? And I can see actually there's an answer on.
That's right. I can say that. Oh, yeah. As Caroline said in her answer there, there is a cross-party and oh goodness, let me get the name right. It's cross-party political and local government group on basic income, which is the secretariat of that is ourselves at Basic Income Conversation and the UBI Lab network. So as Will was saying earlier, lots of amazing work been done over the last few years on basic income, a lot of it by people doing unpaid work, which is ironic and unfortunate, but has led to a lot of success and a lot of engagement with politicians. So that includes a lot of MPs, and largely that came off the back of an action that we did during the pandemic, where hundreds of MPs signed a letter in support of an emergency basic income in response to the pandemic, and that sort of led on from trying to keep those politicians engaged. But it is all levels of government, so it includes from devolved governments in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, and local government as well, because really most of the political work on basic income, the meaningful stuff has come from subnational governments. As you say, like central UK government has done very little on basic income, largely because the stance of the Conservative Party is that universal credit is working and basic income is not worth exploring as that continues to work, which of course we disagree with, and there's been a lot of evidence on the damaging effects of universal credit on people's health and mental health. Thank you, whoever that is from the UBI Lab network in the chat, sharing the Mayor's Pledge and all the great work that you guys have led on that. So the Conservative Party have been very, very unreceptive to any contact we've made about basic income, and in fact cite Stuart's work to prove that a basic income doesn't work, a report published by Compass that in fact shows the impact that a basic income would have on alleviating poverty. That is often the evidence that they cite to explain why they aren't going to go for a basic income, which is unfortunate, but seems that they're not making a very strong case. So essentially we'll be able to move them on that over the next few years. I remain an optimist, but maybe not that optimistic. The Labour Party has no official party policy on universal basic income. There was a brief moment where piloting basic income was in their manifesto. So, you know, this work is a big part of the work that we're doing, again, with the UBI Lab network at the moment, is trying to get as many Labour politicians as possible engaged with the CPPLG and listening to the research that's coming out, particularly this Red Wall paper. Andy Burnham and Jamie Driscoll, Beth Winter, there are some fantastic politicians who are really leading the conversations about basic income, and really it's up to those politicians to take it to the party. So we're doing what we can at the moment to support that work and to push it as far as we can. Liberal Democrats' basic income is party policy, and there is a debate on this on Sunday at Lib Dem conference. They've got basic income policy, and Jane Dodds, leader of Welsh Lib Dems, is doing amazing work. Like, she's really strong on making sure that that policy is as good as possible. So the Liberal Democrats, the most sort of committed, most officially committed to basic income, other than the Green Party, of course, which has had basic income as party policy for a long time. The SNP in Scotland, where I am, they are quite committed to basic income in an independent Scotland, which is an interesting stance and sort of kicks the can down the road a little bit. The work in Scotland on designing a pilot for basic income was fantastic, and I think really it has been the foundation of work on piloting in the UK, how to do that really well. But they did the pilot that they proposed, this really fantastic, very universal, very robust pilot, was needed primary legislation from UK government. So this was also used to transition the policy to look at a minimum income guarantee in this current parliament in Scotland, and hold on to a basic income as an idea for an independent Scotland, should the country so choose. Should we be awarded the opportunity to vote on that? So, I've not done a very organised list in my head of parties. So I think that's, as far as I know, the official manifesto commitment with a model. It's the Greens and the Lib Dems in the UK. Fantastic. So I would like to come to Caroline, ideally, Millie, thank you for your patience too. Did you have a comment about the 1970s that you wanted to make?
I did. This was in the chat rather than the Q&A. It just occurred to me as you were talking about the lack of poverty and inequality in the 70s, and I'm curious about whether that's the real reason why the political right now always seems to use it as something to be scared of. Like, we mustn't ever go back to the 70s, and people want to take us back to the 70s. It's like it's used as a threat of something that we wouldn't want to go back to. And I'm perhaps just being cynical. I'm curious about whether it's actually that there was less poverty and less inequality then. That's my question. Cynically. To the panel.
A cynical question. I think the panel will receive that very favourably. Any comments you wanted to come back with? Stuart, you need to unmute.
Gonna mute. Well, I think the reasons that the Tories keep saying we don't want to go back to the 1970s as they portray it as sort of Labour governments presiding over chaos, and also kind of union power was at its peak, and I think that's what they do. They're trying to make the point that Labour and unions are bad for the economy and bad news generally. Of course, none of that is true. But I think the interesting thing, it's a slight side on your question, but I mean, Liz Truss, who's obviously become, the Prime Minister yesterday, in her public statements in the last 2 days, has now made it very, very clear that she has no intention of making cutting inequality part of her policy agenda. I mean, she basically saying, actually, it'd be better to go the other way. So, in essence, we're back to the philosophy. She's really preaching the philosophy of the 1970s, that, but from a much higher base of inequality, i.e., that what the country needs is another stiff dose of inequality. Not, as she calls it, she talks about we mustn't make policy through the lens of redistribution, i.e., what she means is that we are certainly not going to do anything to make Britain more equal. So I think we're pretty clear now that the new political agenda is let's keep inequality going and even increase it a bit.
Not an agenda that I'm particularly excited about. Anything else from Will or Matthew that you wanted to add on that? No, cool. We'll come to Caroline then. Caroline, did you want to make a comment, add your question?
Yeah. The first question I asked was came out of the chat, and Stuart talked about the lowest fifth incomes. People were just curious whether they were the lowest fifth or not, because I basically poked them and said, who's in the lowest fifth? So my other question is, there is a problem with households, and we have narratives about households and families. They're very popular narratives. And the issue is not everyone's in a multi-person household or in a family. So I live in a house identical to my neighbour that has 4 working adults in it. And I'm on my own and unable to, struggling to get work due to disability and chronic illness. So how do we, bearing in mind that household bills don't really vary that much according to occupation levels. So you won't get much of a difference on your council tax, you'll get no difference on your water bill. And if you're heating a house, your gas and electric isn't going to be drastically different, especially seeing as it's now heavily weighted on standing charges. So how do we prevent the imbalance of a UBI favouring couples and all adult households getting disproportionately more than single people, and single people who can't, for whatever reason, change their circumstances and become part of an all adult household?
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, really, really crucial one. Does anyone who from the panel would like to talk?
The question is basically how to effectively, if you're a single person, your housing circumstances are going to really make inroads into your income, and therefore the basic income will have diminishing returns for them compared to a household with like 4 adults and 2 kids, or let's say two adults and 3 kids. Yeah, the only thing I would say to that is that absolutely that, we should remember that the basic income is not supposed to be a replacement at this stage at all for wages. And, I guess the idea being that if someone's earning a wage as well as having a basic income, they would be able to support themselves, just like how if people had 2 kids, they'd also be earning a wage to pay for their kids as well. So that the income would be distributed slightly more evenly. And secondly, I think I'm all for, we need to reform the housing, the housing market and having a raft of other policies to make sure that housing and other living costs are basically fair. I don't think we should get into a trap of thinking that we should just basically increase basic income in a way to ameliorate some of the much more unequal, so some of the equally unequal policies around housing, rent, energy prices and things like that. So it's both, I agree with you that basically a basic income can't solve all the issues and all of those circumstantial things, because I think actually what will speak to them better is basically effectively a fair price for just living in a modern society. And I think that needs a multiple reform. So I think it's an important point, but one which hopefully can be mitigated by those 2 things basically.
Yeah, I agree in that. Yeah, I think essentially everyone should have a decent income, a livable income for themselves, whether through wages or targeted benefits for disability. Like that all needs to happen as a wraparound to a universal basic income. The fact that it is universal is really crucial to the impact that we want to see it make and that floor that it would build. But it also means that it's limited. It's a blunt instrument for other things. So targeted problems, and the issue for single people is, you don't have that economy of scale. You don't have multiple incomes to run a household. We need to think about policies that target that particular problem, and that is housing, that is energy prices. And it's unfortunate that those things are so dysfunctional. Unfortunate is a very weak word for what I actually mean there. It's brutal that those things are so dysfunctional and the impacts on people are heinous. But that targeted policy needs to come to solve those problems. And for me, I do think basic income as a starting point is good, because it gives us a little bit more freedom, a little bit more space in our life to be noisy about the other things that are broken. That's personally the way that I see the world, the part of the world that I exist in. We are all so overstretched and so underfunded, and on a personal and community level, I think that could make a massive difference for these other big societal changes that need to happen. Joe, thank you for waiting. Thanks for your question. Do you want to come in with it? Nice to not see you, hear you. momentarily.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Very much enjoying the conversation. So my question is about public opinion. And there's been a lot of focus, I guess, on how we could contest the idea of unconditionality in a basic income, and how, you know, that might run against lots of established notions of what the benefit system is like. But one thing that I think has been slightly more ignored on the kind of how to persuade the public is that all basic income models pretty much that we've seen in the last 7 or so years have been funded through the abolition of the income tax allowance. And I think it's quite a challenge to persuade people about the slightly unintuitive idea of taxing people and then giving them the basic income back. And so I wondered what the panelists thought about how people could be kind of, this idea could be explained to them, and how that could be, further the kind of arguments made for these types of basic income models.
Matthew, can I come to you for that?
Thanks very much for that, Joe. And brilliant, we got your part of the bid sorted out. So it's good to have a private discussion in front of 70 people. Fantastic. So my response to you, Joe, is to acknowledge the complexity of this. Sorts of questions that you get in response to funding these sorts of schemes are myriad and extremely complex. And saying to people, look, this is an unconditional payment, is counterintuitive. And especially when you speak to older people who, frankly, seldom had a consequence to failing in their life. It was perfectly possible in one of my dad's friends' cases to become a pretty senior civil servant on the back of a single GCE in the back end of the 60s. It was perfectly possible to go to Borstal and end up successful in business. One of the things that generation who votes en masse just neglect is the extent to which people really are at risk of destitution. Now, the complexity argument that you're talking about there in terms of funding is particularly salient when we're under normal conditions, so the sort of conditions that people have experienced for a significant part of the post-war period. When you get into periods of just perpetual crisis, people's concerns about how you sort things out just disappear. It becomes much less salient. So you get this radical increase in people's concern for efficient and swift monetary interventions to support people's basic needs during the pandemic, and you're getting a similar wave of support for monetary interventions now as the cost of living crisis takes hold. That counterintuitive argument about how you fund something is something that's not insurmountable. And the work we did and have done on this, and I think you've seen bits of the articles that we published, suggests that the public are biddable. I mean, there are loads of different aspects of our present tax system that are totally counterintuitive, that make no sense to people. Marginal tax rates are completely beyond the comprehension of most taxpayers. These are complex systems in need of simplification. And as soon as you introduce tangible means of simplifying systems under conditions of crisis, the sort of crisis that we're encountering at the minute, the general public are fairly open-minded to those sorts of reforms.
Can I just say something about the question of converting the tax allowance into a flat rate payment? That's effectively what you're doing. Is that exactly the same debate took place in the mid-1970s when the Labour Party were under considerable pressure by the anti-poverty charities to convert family allowances into child benefit. And they wanted to do this by abolishing child tax allowances and converting it into a flat rate payment. And the discussions in cabinet were basically that the trade unions in cabinet didn't like this idea, because they said, well, what you're doing is because child benefit goes to the mother. What you're doing is taking away dad's tax allowance from his wages, so his wage will fall, and the beneficiary will be the mother, and they won't understand this. Anyway, so this argument was overcome, and child benefit was introduced, and nobody, as far as I can understand, is saying we should go back to the 1970 system, i.e. that we should have family allowances and child tax allowances simultaneously. So what the basic income idea, funded in part by tax allowance, is saying is that we're actually extending the principle of child benefit to the whole, to adults, and to working adults and to pensioners, using a very similar sort of device that was used to fund it in the 1970s. So yes, I mean, I don't think, I mean, in terms of bringing people with us and overcoming their concerns about these technicalities, I don't think we'll ever sell. I don't think we can introduce a basic income scheme until we've got, public consent, because it is quite a dramatic reform. But actually, what's been happening in the last few years is that we do now have a sort of public, social movement. But because of basic income labs and Scotland's attempt to try, and because of what's happening overseas and all the rest of it, we do have a social movement. It's quite small, but it's certainly exists, that is demanding a basic income, and if we've got to sell the idea more widely, but already I think there is the groundswell of support for a very significant change in the social security system, to make it much more risk averse, much more secure, and much more guaranteed, and not all these terrible rules that disqualify such large sections of the population.
Thank you, Stuart. So we had a question from Guy that I think Samuel's going to ask on his behalf.
Hi there, guys. Fantastic conversation so far. I'm just getting the question up now from one of our members who joined in tonight. So he says, one of the most common worries about UBI amongst those who don't support it is the effect of UBI on the psychology of some people, be it that they may lose motivation or lose the motivation to be economically active. Has there been research about this, and what is the response to counter this concern, to counter this worry? To the panel.
Well, I'm
going to say something briefly, which is in response to that. Which is that if you pitch a basic income at a modest level, i.e., it's £60 a week for an adult, you have a huge incentive to work, because you keep that money. So if you're a couple, mm-hmm. and you're getting your 11,000 a year on basic income, if you go out to work, you keep it all. So there is actually a huge incentive to work. So I think this idea that of course, if you increase the basic income to higher levels, then that does raise questions of motivation. But I mean, but all this is about, what kind of society do we want to create? Do we want to create a society where people are able to, do multiple things simultaneously and not spend the whole of life working? I mean, is it time that we substitute, leisure for work? And what a basic income will do was contribute towards that journey of creating a more flexible, freer society where people have more choice over how they use their time. None of that's going to happen quickly, but if we're looking, to the long term, to the next generation, I think this will create a much more happy, well-being society.
Thank you. Yeah, and the sort of my favourite evidence-based answer to a question essentially is disproving the idea that, well, if what we mean by economically inactive is not doing paid work, one of the most robust, complicated sort of conclusions drawn from the many different trials that have been done globally is that there is quite a limited, across all the different types of study, varying different levels of how much is paid, different ways of it being paid, different communities are selected. The impact on people leaving the workforce or people deciding just not to work and just to live on their basic income is very rare. Like most people, the labour market participation or people, the amount of paid hours that people work maintain is pretty much the same when they're receiving a basic income as when they aren't. Probably largely driven by what Stuart was saying, because they get to keep all of the money from both things other than what's taxed. The only times that people don't stay in paid work at the same rate is people with young children and young people that enter into education, which again, as we've talked about, different kind of outcomes, or the kind of outcomes Stuart's hoping to see, those two things likely to lead to them. Matthew, did you want to jump in and then we'll?
Yeah, I think it is really important to emphasise that there is just no substantive evidence to suggest that people would become inactive. But beyond that, if you think yourself, right, even if you receive minimum income standard payments up to 10 grand, I don't think I would stop work for 10 grand. I don't think many people would stop work for 10 grand. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that people who really do have a basic income by virtue of trust fund inheritances still work. George Osborne still works. He's rich enough to stop work. He still works. What it does is give you the ability to renegotiate your relationship with work. And there's a lot of work that's being done today that is totally pointless, which is environmentally destructive, which leads to damage and harm to people's health, to people's well-being. It is pointless. And there are a number of different jobs that can be done away with overnight, with no consequence, no negative consequence to society. You speak to young people these days and they have no connection, they see no necessary connection between work and manifestly improving the material circumstances, enabling them to buy houses, enabling them to have families. Actually, that link has already been broken. And this actually gives us the capacity to be much more active economically in ways that benefit society much more clearly. The argument of parasitism just doesn't find substance in the evidence.
Yeah, I think that point about jobs that can be done away with without having any social consequence. With a basic income, you don't have to actively abolish those jobs or legislate against those jobs. You'll just see people exiting them because they have, well, hopefully, if it's all done right, you see people exiting them because they have other choices and more time and more freedom to make those choices in terms of their work. Well,
just really briefly, I mean, I think just to counter the other side of this coin, which to the idea that there's no evidence for that being true, the basic claim, but there's a lot of evidence to show that actually the current system of conditionality and means testing actually does dissuade people from doing, like, it just simply doesn't work. Basically, just people are jumping through hoops. You know, I would point people towards a really great study led by Sharon. I can't remember, Sharon Wright, who on welfare conditionality, basically huge, large sample, multi-year project looking at does going through the system of job searching, you have to kind of clock in, lots of this behavior testing, does that actually have the outcomes of finding work, and does it kind of inculcate a kind of attitude that is say productivist or whatever we want to call it? And it just simply doesn't. The system that does not, the outcomes are not there, and so we have that kind of system which doesn't really, it wants to force that kind of those outcomes when it's not an individual's deficiency, it's the conditions of the labor market, it's the lack of good jobs, wage stagnation, and so on. So I think it's important to kind of upset these myths around, well, basically a myth that we need to basically kind of crack the whip around people's attitudes. I think it's important to dispel that and look at the evidence that shows that that's simply not the case.
Thank you. Yeah, David in the chat saying, speaking as a retired person effectively living on a basic income, it hasn't affected my desire to work and make a contribution to society. Quite the reverse. I do think yeah, retired people are also a massive source of evidence that people living on something that resembles a basic income are incredibly productive for society. Annie Miller retired, poured her time into, basic income, and I wouldn't be here without her. There's just, retired people across the country, whether that's childcare duties or, community activism. I think they're a massive source of evidence for that. And yeah, a lot to be grateful for too. That unpaid work or that informal work that I'm sure society is absolutely dependent on. Samuel, did you have another question for us?
Yes, I did. One of our members brought in a really good question on the concept of freedom. He or she said, is there a way to frame UBI in terms of giving back freedom, supporting people to make their own decisions, giving people the opportunity to live their lives and succeed in their own terms than mopping up failure? I think that is something that really would appeal, especially as we're discussing basic income as a vote winner. I think those sort of core principles that I think everyone can apply from the left to the right. I think that's something that is a really great question. And I'll open it up to the panel.
Matthew, did freedom come up in your narratives? Well, not your narratives.
Yeah, so it did, but that's very abstract. So it's a really abstract concept, and what you tend to find is that people give tangible examples. So there were people who are saying, look, by virtue of the fact you work, this is going to be like a little bonus for you that enables you to do things like go on a nice holiday or something, right? So that's a tangible material benefit. I mean, in terms of like general sense of freedom, that's very vague, but it speaks to an increase in opportunity that people have access to. So I think increase in opportunity, yes, and especially when that increase in opportunity is tied to really quite tangible ends.
Thank you. Anything else on freedom from the panel? Or talking, yeah, using that as a framing. Cool. I had a question. What's your favorite short, sweet myth buster for basic income? Is this, I don't know if this is an easy one to find on the top of your head. Maybe we've already covered it in the session, but again, I think when we're talking about winning the vote, this is something that when we're talking to people, friends, family, it's really useful to have those little sound bites or those really compelling arguments that just roll off the tongue to initiate those conversations even. But also when we're speaking to politicians, I think this is something that I want to encourage everyone on the call and everyone listening to this, like, they're there to be spoken to. We should be contacting our elected representatives and encouraging them into conversations about basic income as often as possible. And again, once we've published the report and you have access to those narratives and that full case in writing, give it a read and do send it over to your elected representatives and make sure that they are paying attention to it and putting again those narratives into action in their job. Have you got any for me, guys?
So I think, like, in terms of, I saw something like a 3-word slogan.
Yes.
Emerging from the evidence, something like, this is for you. People think of welfare as for others. Welfare is for others, and that's why they're not keen to contribute to it and see it as parasitic. UBI is for you, and as soon as you frame it as a benefit specifically for people themselves, so through reference to them being, through reference to their own sense of self as being aspirational, hardworking, all of these sorts of things, completely change the way in which they perceive the policy.
Absolutely. Yeah, I have the same dynamic when people are like, well, why do other people deserve it? I think often deservingness is the main blocker. Like, people don't feel that they are deserving of it themselves personally. I think that is actually the number one, but also looking over each other's shoulders and being encouraged to do that all the time. I think people feel like, well, why do they deserve it? But when you say you deserve it too, everyone deserves it, everyone gets it. Yeah, I like that one a lot, Matthew. And do add yours in the chat as well if you have any, and I'll read them out. Favorite line on basic income. Will, did you have one? Stuart?
I think my mind's too filled up with arguing about technical stuff. People say, it will have no effect because they read a paper a while ago and they just haven't got up to date. So it's more like, it's less about winning, you know, and it's kind of like a really important slogan. There's more like, I've just got things I always need to kind of come back with, stats about reduction in poverty and so on. So I'm afraid I'm no good today because I'm fighting a different fight.
It's good. The technical stuff's good too. We do have a talking points document as part of the basic income conversation toolkit, which has sort of the common criticisms or questions or misconceptions about basic income rebuffed when relatively short arguments. But yeah, that technical stuff's difficult. But yeah, the inflation argument, the wages argument, we've covered that today. Stuart, do you have a favourite?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the phrases that's used by opponents is that it will encourage a culture of idleness. And I think we we've dealt with that. That it doesn't do that at all. So it's extremely easy to counter that argument. And secondly, is the cost issue. What opponents do is they quote the gross cost. So they say, look, this is ridiculous. It's going to cost, a fifth of GDP, a fifth of the size of the economy, to pay everybody, 60 quid a week. But they ignore all the ways that is the net cost. And, what we've tried to do is to produce schemes that have a net cost of zero, i.e. that the benefits paid out are equal to the additional revenue that you generate to pay for it. So yes, I mean, I think what's interesting on this is that over the last few months, and after the last 2 or 3 years rather, some of the institutions and individuals that have been most opposed to the idea of a basic income have actually been softening their stance, and there are quite a few converts among some quite unlikely sources, because in part we're having a national debate, and these issues are being discussed in the press and and local hubs and in gatherings like this and so on. So I think BI is slowly winning the argument. We've got a bit of way to go, though.
Indeed, bit of a way to go. Thank you so much to everyone. I think this is a good place for us to stop, and a strange place for the basic income conversation to stop talking about one-liners and argument winners. Very much not the approach that we tend to take or tend to encourage. I think it is such a complicated topic, and universality, a universal basic income, it would affect all of us differently, and that's again why those conversations are so important, and allowing people to have those initial reactions that maybe aren't always so positive about basic income. And this research that we'll be publishing soon that Matthew's led really proves that even people whose initial reaction to basic income is, what a stupid idea, you're wasting your time talking about that, you think too highly of people, they'll waste it, like even that can come to a pace that is more productive, and at least they can see the benefits to some degree from a careful and open-minded conversation. So yeah, do join us on the 21st of September for one of those careful, open-minded, enjoyable conversations for the big basic income conversation. I hope to see you there. I hope to get to chat to you there and hear other people's voices for most of that. But yes, thanks again for this evening. Massive thank you to our panel. Really excited to be publishing the upcoming paper, so looking forward to sharing that with you, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks again.
Cheers guys, good to see everyone. See ya.
Thanks everybody. Bye.